In 1881, a massive engineering project began in Panama that was supposed to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It was led by the French, who had just built the iconic Suez Canal. But instead of triumph, the endeavor became a catastrophe. More than 22,000 workers lost their lives, and the French effort collapsed under the weight of disease, corruption, and financial ruin. How did a nation celebrated for its engineering fail so miserably? The Panama Canal is one of the most important waterways in the world. Every year, it facilitates the movement of goods worth billions of dollars, significantly reducing travel time between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Let's shine some light on the French attempt to build the canal, the challenges they faced, and how the United States eventually stepped in where France failed. This is Ferdinand de Lesseps, the mastermind behind the Suez Canal. In 1881, he launched an ambitious project to build a canal through the Isthmus of Panama. Lesseps envisioned a sea-level canal, similar to the one in Egypt. His reputation as a world-class engineer attracted more than half of the capital needed to form a company to build the Panama Canal through subscriptions from the French. Optimism ran high as construction began. The cost of the Panama Canal was estimated at $214 million. It was revised and reduced by de Lesseps to $120 million. So why did the French fail to successfully build the Panama Canal? The reality in Panama was starkly different from what Lesseps had experienced in Egypt. The terrain was treacherous, the climate was unforgiving, and the jungle was teeming with deadly diseases. Workers were unprepared for the harsh conditions. The company also underestimated the engineering complexity of cutting through the dense, mountainous terrain of Panama. Unlike the flat deserts of Egypt, Panama's geography was filled with steep mountains, thick jungles, and heavy rainfall. Cutting through the Continental Divide, a massive mountain range, required removing millions of cubic meters of rock and soil. The tools and machinery available at the time were not advanced enough to handle this monumental task. Flooding and landslides became frequent, destroying months of work overnight. Lesseps stubbornly insisted on a sea-level canal, refusing to consider alternative designs like locks, which would have been more practical given the terrain. Diseases like malaria and yellow fever devastated the workforce. At the time, the link between mosquitoes and these diseases was not understood. Workers lived in unsanitary camps, surrounded by stagnant water, a breeding ground for mosquitoes. By 1889, the death toll had reached 25,000, and many more workers abandoned the project, unwilling to risk their lives. The French project was plagued by poor financial oversight. The cost of construction spiraled out of control, far exceeding initial estimates. In desperation, the company launched new rounds of fundraising from French citizens, many of whom invested their life savings. By the late 1880s, the project was drowning in debt. Some 800,000 French citizens saw their entire investment wiped out. Corruption scandals erupted, implicating high-ranking officials and financiers. Public outrage over the misuse of funds led to one of the largest financial scandals in French history. The company declared bankruptcy in 1889, marking the end of the French effort. Despite the failure, the groundwork laid by the French would prove invaluable for the Americans when they took over the project years later. When the French abandoned their efforts in 1889, the dream of a canal through Panama seemed impossible. Yet by the early 20th century, the United States saw an opportunity. With growing economic and military ambitions, America recognized the strategic importance of controlling a canal that connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. In 1903, the U.S. government struck a pivotal deal with Panama. After supporting Panama's independence from Colombia, the U.S. signed the Haibunau-Varilla Treaty, granting America control over a 10-mile-wide canal zone. In return, Panama received $10 million up front and an annual payment of $250,000. While the treaty allowed the U.S. to proceed with construction, it created decades of resentment among Panamanians who felt their sovereignty was compromised. This issue would resurface many years later, leading to significant political tensions. Unlike the French, the Americans approached the project with a more realistic plan. They opted for a lock-based canal rather than a sea-level design. This decision was revolutionary. It allowed ships to be raised and lowered between sea level and the artificial Gatun Lake, eliminating the need to cut through the mountainous terrain entirely. The U.S. government appointed John Frank Stevens, an experienced railroad engineer, to lead the project in 1905. Stevens focused on improving worker conditions and logistics, setting up proper housing, sanitation, and transportation for workers. By addressing these issues, Stevens reduced attrition and improved efficiency. In 1907, George Washington Goethals, a U.S. Army engineer, took over as chief engineer. Under his leadership, the canal finally took shape. Teams worked tirelessly, using advanced machinery like steam shovels and hydraulic dredges to remove rock and soil. One of the critical factors behind America's success was their understanding of the role of mosquitoes in spreading diseases like yellow fever and malaria. Dr. William Gorgas, a U.S. Army physician, implemented rigorous sanitation measures, including draining stagnant water, fumigating living quarters, and introducing mosquito nets. By 1906, these efforts had nearly eradicated yellow fever from the canal zone and significantly reduced cases of malaria. This marked a turning point as worker mortality rates dropped and recruitment became easier. After nearly a decade of effort, the Panama Canal was completed in 1914 at a cost of $375 million, far less than the French had spent on their failed attempt. In today's money, that's roughly equivalent to $11.6 billion. On August 15, 1914, the first ship, the SS Ancon, passed through the canal, marking the start of a new era in global trade. The canal immediately transformed maritime shipping. Ships could now avoid the treacherous journey around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, saving weeks of travel time and thousands of miles. Though the US succeeded where the French had failed, it came at a significant human cost. Over 5,600 workers died during the American construction effort, adding to the 25,000 lives lost under French management. For much of the 20th century, the canal remained under US jurisdiction. This arrangement, while advantageous for the US, was a source of deep resentment in Panama. Tensions boiled over during protests in 1964 when Panamanians demanded sovereignty over the canal. In 1977, US President Jimmy Carter and Panamanian leader Omar Torrijos signed the Torrijos-Carter Treaties, agreeing to transfer control of the canal to Panama by December 31, 1999. This historic handover marked a new chapter for the canal and restored Panama's full sovereignty. Since taking control, the Panamanian government has modernized and expanded the canal, proving its ability to manage one of the world's most complex engineering marvels. The Panama Canal has come a long way since its completion in 1914. It connects over 144 trade routes and serves more than 1,700 ports worldwide.